The Senior Advisor for Innovation in the Office of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Alec and I have known one another for some years now, and we worked on the campaign together, we worked on the presidential transition, and in my infinite wisdom, when Alec was considering many of the various options that he had open to him, because he had worked on innovation issues in the campaign, had been an advisor to then Senator Obama on innovation issues. He said, you know, I'm really interested in international affairs. I'm thinking about maybe doing work at the State Department. And I said, Alec, I've worked with the State Department, and I'm not sure that's...
You advised against it.
Well, I was trying but it's true. I said, well, you know, it's a tough building. Not sure this will work. And of course, he fortunately ignored my advice.
I take most of your advice.
Well, thank you for saying that.
It's true.
But he's going to share his views today. So I should say a little bit about his background. He co-founded a very interesting organization called One Economy, which is a nonprofit that works to develop urban areas and also think progressively and think about the future of the American economy in a global context, considering both social issues and distribution of wealth and opportunity, as well as the more traditional economic issues, and had a very successful career there, played a very important role in thinking about innovation within the Obama administration, and is doing some enormously interesting things, both on the technological side, like coming up with ideas to drop innovation in internet in a box.
Suitcase.
Yep. Behind enemy lines, not enemy lines, but behind...
just allowing people to exercise their universal rights.
Good diplomat.
They got me trained.
Right. And also really helping the secretary, working very closely with the secretary on statecraft for the 21st century. Very, very important topic. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Alec.
Great. Well, thank you all for taking some time to visit with me this morning. I'm not going to give a speech. I just want to make a few brief remarks, and then Dean Wilson will facilitate. He'll ask me some questions, but hopefully we'll also have more of a facilitated discussion with all of you, because I find that the question and answer and the discussion is oftentimes far more illuminating than any prepared remarks. Let me say at the outset that those of you who are here at the Annenberg School are studying communications at a truly fascinating time in history. You are in exactly the right place. You're in exactly the right field at exactly the right time. And I say that from the perspective of somebody who's sort of been an eyewitness to the changing nature of power over the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And now power is something that people don't actually say that word aloud very often. It's almost sort of rude to talk about power aloud. But I think as a very practical matter, the field of communications is one that is playing a remarkably disruptive role right now in the distribution of power. And in fact, as I was telling Dean Wilson as we were visiting prior to this, if I've learned one thing in the past 3 years working for Secretary Clinton at the State Department, it is that there is a massive shift in geopolitical power globally right now. Now, most people think about that in terms of geography, from west to east, from Europe and North America to Asia, and from the global north to the global south. Now, whether that is true or not, and the extent to whether that is true or not, I think that is far less the case than the redistribution of power that's taking place because of connection technologies, because of communications, from hierarchies, including, by the way, the nation state, from hierarchies to citizens and networks of citizens. And this is something that I think is happening in nearly all 195 countries on planet Earth. And oh, by the way, the United States is not immune to this. The most illustrative example I think that people have seen from this, it has been from the events from the Arab revolutions, where we've seen citizens and networks of citizens have capabilities that historically would have been reserved for institutions or movements that would have been much longer in the building, much longer in development. But we've also seen it in places including China and the United States. In China, for example, a country that spends more money and dedicates far more resources than any other to controlling its information environment. There have been a number of examples from the past year that I think show the fragmenting control of China over its information environment. We just hit 500 million internet users in China, half of whom are under the age of 25. And to try to control the information environment in so hyper-networked an environment, I think, is naive. And for all the billions of dollars that you spend, for all the tens of thousands of people you employ, I think ultimately that's a failing strategy. And I think, but just by way of illustration, this was borne out in a train crash that some of you may be familiar with from July of last year, where, by way of very quick explanation, there was a train crash. 40 people died, 190 people were injured. And the response, the official state response, which is sort of according to the textbook, you issue the media guidelines, the media reports exactly that which the state dictates what will be reported, including, foreign technology failed us, everything was done exactly to spec. But what's interesting is because of Sina Weibo, a Chinese sort of variant of Twitter, over the course of a handful of days, more than 6 million Chinese citizens sent more than 21,000 messages using this messaging platform, including, oh, by the way, a great many people who were actually on the trains or witness to the accident. And they completely contradicted the narrative, the official state narrative. And this had the force and effect of literally having the Chinese information infrastructure flip, do a 180. They had actually buried the train cars on the site, and they actually had to disinter the train cars as they said that they would reopen an investigation. They actually fired some of the bureaucrats who were behind the project, whom previously they had said that there had been no mistakes made by them. And so I share this by a simple way of illustration that surgical actions by a nation state like the Chinese to erase from networks a single figure like, say, Ai Weiwei might work. But things that are truly more networked or distributed do not lend themselves to state control. At one point, if you search for my name on Chinese search engines, you would have gotten about 3 million results. And then one day, it went from 3 million to 0. So I was literally wiped off the Chinese internet. I choose to be flattered by this. And that can be done. The state can have those kinds of capabilities. But when you're talking about phenomena or individuals or movements that are more networked in nature, then the nature of state control will diminish. Similarly, I think we've seen a profound example of the transfer of power from hierarchies to citizens and networks of citizens here in the United States. I'm not some guy from Washington here saying, ooh, look at the changing nature of power in the Arab world, in China, and here and there. No, I think that the most recent and most profound example of this can be seen in the United States with the debate around 2 proposed pieces of online piracy legislation in the United States, SOPA and PIPA. From the head nods, I see that all of you are familiar with this. What's fascinating is that the debate in Congress about these 2 proposed pieces of legislation started off in sort of the very typically Washington binary way. It was Hollywood and the content constituencies against Northern California and the internet constituencies. It was one versus the other. Hire your lobbyists. Who are your powerful friends in power? Let's work the phones. What's the ground game going to be in terms of our committee, in terms of the committees and what's the conference strategy going to be? But then what's really fascinating, it was the rise of a campaign, in essence, that was citizen-centered in opposition to these two pieces of legislation. And while the role of Jimmy Wales at Wikipedia and Google as a corporation gets a great amount of attention, I think truthfully the real power behind these movements were vested in citizens. And what's interesting is I spoke to a great many people at the very highest levels of government whose children had never spoken to them previously about their jobs. And all of a sudden, the 17-year-old is going up to the high-ranking member of the Obama administration saying, oh, me and 500 of my classmates signed a petition, hands off our internet. And so I think that this, and I think that what happened is very, very significant in terms of this distribution of power to citizens in the United States. And so I really do see this manifesting itself in a very interesting way. And so all of you are in the right fields. A lot of my focus right now is trying to figure out what this means for diplomacy and what this means in terms of America's foreign policy interests. And it's frankly, it's disruptive. And when I say disruptive, I actually tend that to be, I'm one of the people who, for me, disruption is actually an implicit good. That's not necessarily the case among most people, and certainly not among most people in Washington. But I think every industry has somehow been disrupted by connectivity. Every industry has somehow had to adapt to a world where processing and distribution power, disintermediation is taking place in ways that were previously unimaginable. And there's no reason why that ought not be the case in diplomacy. And in fact, I think that we are fully having to come to grips with the fact that the very nature of being a diplomat is having to pivot somewhat in the face of citizens and citizen-centered movements becoming so powerful. What does this mean as a practical matter? What this means as a practical matter is that historically what high-ranking diplomats would do, ambassadors and such people, is that when they would travel to a foreign capital, they would meet with, or if you were an ambassador to a country, your typical interlocutor was a government minister, a general, or a CEO. And if you engaged with the government minister, the general, the CEO, the editor-in-chief of the big newspaper, then you understood what was going on in a country. And through those small number of relationships, you were able to exercise power and do so in service to America's foreign policy interests. Well, today, if your only interactions as a diplomat are with a government minister, a general, CEO, and the editor-in-chief of the newspaper, you might very well have absolutely no idea what is actually going on in the country. And in fact, there might be a revolution that really catches you by surprise. And so what's fascinating, and what's fascinating, frankly, fun for me, is to see the degree to which hyperconnectivity within society is changing the nature of power itself throughout the world, and how we as diplomats and practitioners of foreign policy have to pivot in the face of that. My last point, and then we'll go into some discussion, into some Q&A, has been as a matter of policy. So one of the things that we've done, which has sort of been a signature initiative of ours, and certainly a signature initiative of Hillary Clinton's, has been to look at rights in the context of living in a networked world. Hillary Clinton is America's 67th Secretary of State. Our first was Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson said, "The only legitimate foundation for government is the will of its people, and to preserve its free expression should be our first order." Now, if you are going to carry that value from the first Secretary of State to the 67th Secretary of State, if you believe in universal rights and universal values like the freedom of expression, the freedom of association and assembly, if you believe in a free press, then you have to believe in all of those things in the cyber domain. And so in January of 2010, a year before the Arab Spring, Hillary Clinton launched an Internet freedom agenda, which, in a manner of speaking, is sort of human rights agenda for the 21st century, where part of what we are seeking to do is to make sure networked spaces, new technologies respect old rights. And I should say, as somebody who's been involved with this from the outset, and as somebody who in the 8 years preceding going into government did nothing but try to bring technology into the homes and communities of poor people, I actually think that this is a very difficult and very troubling time in this domain. I think that as the force and effect of technology has become more evident to everybody, I think that you are seeing a reaction from nation states. I think that government is no longer going to ignore geeks. I think that government is going to increasingly view the internet, social media, networked spaces as being places that are not just competitive, but areas of conflict. And so as we put some real shoulder into our internet freedom agenda, part of what I've come to believe is that this is going to be one of the most competitive domains in foreign policy for the next 5 years. And I think it's going to be of grand consequence. I think it's going to be of grand economic consequence, of grand political consequence. And I think, frankly, that it remains to be seen what the internet looks like in 5 years. If it is truly one internet, or whether as network technologies become more sophisticated, nation states, including their intelligence services, suddenly have the capabilities to sort of build the internet to spec and to comport with what they want in terms of law enforcement, what they want in terms of content censorship and such things. And so I think that this initiative, which Hillary Clinton launched with enormous prescience in January of 2010, focused on internet freedom, as you enter the work world, as you ascend in academia, as you join NGOs, the media, journalism, or whatever industries you go into, I have a feeling this thing that was once sort of foreign policy arcana, internet freedom, is going to be something of significance to all of you in your work world. So with that, I'll shut up. And the one thing that I'll say before Dean Wilson begins a facilitated discussion is, even though I'm a diplomat, I would encourage you to ask your most undiplomatic questions, because those, frankly, tend oftentimes to be the most interesting. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me start off with a couple of quick questions, then I'll turn it over to the audience. We have until about noon, so I think we have a good time to have an open discussion. So you're saying that the business world has experienced these disruptive changes,
yep.
And government has also is experiencing them, but needs to explore those even more. And here we are in the university, which is also being challenged with the ability to both respond and anticipate these changes taking place. And you and I were talking a little bit before, and we were talking about things that very specifically the University of Southern California or the Annenberg School might begin to think about, the kinds of research that we might do. And perhaps you could share that with this group. And you mentioned two things that were quite interesting where we might be able to contribute our research or interns, et cetera. So maybe you could say something about that.
Sure. So one of the things that I think is fascinating is to look at the changing nature of information environments. By way of illustration, Tunisia. In Tunisia in 2008, which was not that long ago, there were 28,000 Facebook accounts. So basically the Sorbonne-educated sons and daughters of the elite. 2 years later, just 2 years, there were 1.4 million. 1.4 million Facebook accounts in a country of less than 10 million, up from 28,000 in 2 years. The very interesting thing about this is what changed. The change that resulted from that sort of hockey stick slope adaption of social media was a changed information environment. A lot of people think that Mohammed Bouazizi, the person who literally lit himself on fire on December 17th of 2010 and thus began the Arab Spring, they thought that that was some unique moment, a unique spark. Point in fact, people had actually been lighting themselves on fire in previous years in Tunisia. In 2006, a merchant had actually lit themselves on fire. And this caused a great amount of disruption in one village for one day. And so what's interesting to me is to see how the changing nature of the information environment in Tunisia had outsized impacts in terms of what then followed. So what's interesting to me, and what I don't have answers to, but what I bet a lot of you could research and develop answers for, is as other parts of the globe become increasingly networked, what is the changing nature of the information environment? What are the implications for society, not just political and not just in terms of, quote, revolution, but also thinking in terms of, what about countries with low levels of literacy, where the internet may not be necessarily what people are accessing over all of these new cell phones. So one area that I think of really interesting exploration is to look at the changing nature of information environments all around the world, and to understand what the implications of this are, particularly in nations in Southeast Asia and what have you, that are themselves now becoming more networked, but where people might principally be accessing content through SMS or other things than, say, Western social media platforms. So there's one area. I can't immediately think of what the second one was. Dean, prompt me.
Yes. I think so. The shift from hierarchy to networks and to how that works.
Yeah. So I mean, look, this whole observation about the shifting nature of power from hierarchies to citizens and networks of citizens, I can tell 100 stories, but I haven't actually seen much in the way of research in this domain. And again, I think this is the single biggest deal in foreign policy. Period. There's an enormous amount that's been written about, the new Asia and the power of the global South and America's role in a multipolar world. What I'm interested is what I haven't seen research about, but what I can tell 100 stories about is, what about the shifting nature of power from hierarchies in large institutions to citizens and networks of citizens. I'll give sort of one example of how this played out. Have any of you ever heard of this thing called WikiLeaks? 2 or 3 of you. WikiLeaks is an interesting example of this. WikiLeaks would not have been physically possible 10 years ago. The combination of physical processing power and bandwidth available at the desktop of a 22-year-old Army private would have been insufficient to download 250,000 plus alleged cables. Further, the WikiLeaks organization itself, which is largely made up of members and followers instead of paid staff, with a web address instead of a street address, which is truly networked and transnational in nature. This is a virtual organization that was able to exert, for lack of a better word, power against the interests of the world's strongest nation. And so WikiLeaks is a fascinating illustration of this, where literally members and followers instead of paid staff, a web address instead of a street address, truly transnational in nature. I mean, this is a phenomenon unique to the day, right? And so another area I think of what could be very interesting academic exploration is, what is behind the shifting nature of power? And is there anything that can be done using different statistical models to evaluate this or bear this out?
And one of the things that's especially interesting here at the Annenberg School, for the last 2 days we've organized a conference, a seminar with 4 senior officials from the Federal Communications Commission. And we came out and their concern is that they have kind of a linear econometric model of diversity and how it translates from upstream issues to diverse content. And one of the principal metaphors and paradigms that we talked about was an ecology metaphor.
Yes.
Which is you can't just look at legacy media, you can't just look at the internet and social media. You have to figure out the ways in which these things mutually affect one
Correct.
another. And in many of our schools around the country, whether it's business schools or communication schools, we're just beginning to understand that in our local communities in South Central. And I think what Alec is raising is the possibility of taking that metaphor, that paradigm which has been developed much of the work here by Sandra Ball, Rakich, and others, in a local setting and apply it to a Tunisia or apply it to, to China. So I think it's one of these examples where we might have some comparative advantage in doing this, and so I think Alec is inviting us to...
Yes, I mean, technology is changing the ecology of geopolitics. Period, full stop. And it's really interesting. So a lot of people, I've stopped thinking about, you know, connection technologies as tools, per se. What I actually am now seeing is how they're actually changing the ecology in and around geopolitics. It's really interesting.
Let's open it up to questions. Yes, sir.
Yes. I have a question about...
just name, rank, and
Sure.
circle.
My name is Josh Lockman. I'm a lecturer at USC Law School. I teach international law and U.S. foreign policy. I have a question about Ambassador Ford in Syria and whether his recent diplomatic efforts, obviously, both physically on the ground and online on Facebook, kind of herald some type of precedent for hyper-expedited diplomacy. I think that goes along with what you're discussing. I just want to see what you thought about that as a model for future American diplomacy.
So Rob Ford, our ambassador to Syria, first of all, is a great diplomat. He's doing an amazing job in the face of, frankly, a lot of physical danger and the most difficult environment imaginable. So by way of illustration, for those of you who aren't familiar with some of the background to what the gentleman described just now, Ambassador Ford has done both online and offline activity that I think has been very interesting. Number one, he has physically gone into some of the conflict centers and into some of the protest sites in Syria and sort of has done some firsthand reporting in what has taken place there. It's been a big deal. It's been a very big deal. The second thing he's done is recognize that Syrian media will never give anything approaching fair treatment to anything that Ambassador Ford says. What he does is he publishes on Facebook. And here's what's really interesting, is he would make a blog post, and then the first couple things that would happen is there's this thing called the Syrian Electronic Army, which is essentially a bunch of paid Syrian propagandists, would literally use a tactic that we on the Obama campaign called flood the zone. They would flood the zone with comments. So 500 comments that would say, we love Bashar, you're undermining our sovereignty, go back to Washington, blah, blah, blah. And this would happen 500 times with 500 different profiles. And so the challenge to Ambassador Ford then was, does he then say, well, shoot, that didn't work. Look, there were 2 nice comments and 500 people, telling me what an idiot I am. And the interesting and important thing that he did was he persisted. And what then happened was the Syrian citizens themselves, the real Syrian citizens, saw what was happening, and they then began to engage in these dialogues. And so he would do a 200-word blog post. It would get 1,500 comments. And it would be hundreds of comments from the Syrian Electronic Army, but then there would be real people outing the Syrian Electronic Army and outing the individuals behind it, and then debating it. And so the answer to your question is yes. I do think that in closed information environments, these spaces which are less prone to control allow us to communicate in ways that otherwise aren't possible. I'll give 2 additional illustrations of this. So Mike McFaul, former professor at Stanford, is about 3 weeks into a new job as America's ambassador to Russia. He, like so many of the academics here, wrote, some full-throated academic work at Stanford, which doesn't read like diplomacy. And when he went to Russia, as soon as the wheels hit the tarmac, sort of the state-controlled and state-influenced media in Russia began hammering him, just hammering him. The revolutionary come to Moscow to undermine our sovereignty. And so what Ambassador McFaul has done is he has aggressively used social media himself as a way of sort of trying to pop the balloon of this caricature that people have attempted to develop of him through official media. Last example I'll point to, just so people don't think of this as being something overly Western, Zimbabwe. So there's a gentleman named Charlie Ray. He's our ambassador to Zimbabwe. He's been in government for 45 years. He's in his late 60s. And Zimbabwe is a place of a relatively closed information environment, closed media environment, but where Mugabe does not have the technical capabilities and the resources to do the sort of network level censorship, the likes of which is done by, say, the Chinese. And so what Ambassador Ray has done is he has used social media, and the forms of social media used principally by Zimbabweans as a way of creating a dialogue and a discussion the likes of which wouldn't have been possible 5 years ago. So that's a long way of saying the answer to your question is yes.
Students, I'd just like to see some students raise their hand. Yes.
Hi, I'm Alex Laverty. I'm a public diplomacy student here at Annenberg. Last semester I wrote a paper on the net freedom that the State Department's doing. And I was wondering now with how does SOPA relate to U.S. public diplomacy? Because the part that I found out is that while net freedom is nice, you have to back it up at home with your own freedom. So how is the State Department reacting to SOPA?
Yeah, so there was a strong, I think you
asked for tough questions.
No, but it's actually, it's an easy question to answer. The White House issued an unequivocal statement about what we would and would not support. Period. I mean, the White House, you should read the blog post that was issued, 2 or 3 Saturdays ago. It said, we will not support legislation that undermines freedom of expression or an open internet, an innovative internet. And so I think that the statement of the White House stands on its own. It is not highly parsed. It is a very straightforward statement of policy, and it clearly sets out what we won't support. And so in the face of that, I think that does nothing but enhance our stature abroad on issues of internet freedom. I also think it's important, because there's a very clear statement from President Obama about what we will and what we will not support. The second thing is, I think it's important to recognize is that for those of you who ever watched Sunday morning cartoons, you saw this thing called Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law. And SOPA and PIPA, neither of them became law. And so so sort of a hypothetical based on a theoretical about what the impact on our foreign policy would have been, because neither of them got out of their respective arms of the legislature and certainly weren't passed into law. So I think our standing has only been enhanced by it.
You sure? Yeah. Okay. Tom, did you have your hand up?
I did, but Jacqueline is a student who's ready to go.
Okay, good. Ask away.
Well, this was a follow-up to that.
I'll come up from behind the media there.
It's a voice from behind the wall.
So although SOPA and PIPA...
Identify yourself.
I'm Jacqueline Selby. I'm a PhD student here at Annenberg. So although SOPA and PIPA are domestic pieces of legislation, what about the White House's relationship to the ACTA, the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement? Doesn't that have some restrictions on freedom of expression?
So I think it's important when you actually have to break down these different pieces of law and legislation. The things that, if you look at SOPA and PIPA, there were 4 specific quote-unquote remedies, 2 of which were financial mechanisms, one which had to do with search engine blacklisting, one which had to do with DNSSEC interventions. We have to specifically identify that which is objectionable to us. Now, in terms of, I won't speak to ACTA specifically, but in terms of anti-counterfeiting measures, if the content being transmitted is clearly illegal, and if the remedy does not undermine the internet, then I think it's perfectly reasonable for us to seek to police that using due process and rule of law and such things, as long as the remedies themselves are not malignant in nature. But freedom of the internet freedom does not mean the freedom to do anything you want on the internet. All of our rights come with a corresponding set of responsibilities. So in the United States, for example, we have the right to bear arms. The right to bear arms does not mean that you can walk around campus and shoot a gun. Similarly, freedom of expression means that even though we believe in freedom of expression, there are still things such as, you're not allowed to libel somebody, you're not allowed to slander somebody, with internet freedom, we believe in an open and free internet, but that doesn't mean you're allowed to transmit child pornography. It doesn't mean that because we believe in internet freedom, you have the freedom to commit financial fraud using the internet. Similarly, it doesn't mean that you have the right to traffic in stolen intellectual property. The distinction between various of these treaties and proposed pieces of legislation go to what is the remedy. Okay, if you're against online piracy, what are you going to do about it? So even though we made a clear statement as it related to SOPA and PIPA, what we did not say is, oh, it's okay to steal intellectual property. We actually do believe that rights holders have rights, which ought to be protected. The question is, what is the remedy? And is the remedy acceptable, or is it malignant, and does it undermine the way in which the internet works?
Mr. Aronson.
Jonathan Aronson. I'd like you to, you've been talking a lot about the role of ambassadors.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a lot written at various times that said that various communications technologies had the effect of changing ambassadors from ambassadors plenipotentiary, which we had before communications, to ones where the shots were mainly called in Washington. What you've been talking about today with McFaul and Ford is people who have sort of in the countries to which they are ambassadors, going out and having influence. The question I have is, what is the relationship now between Washington and the 7th floor of the State Department and the ambassadors in terms of how much leeway do they have in terms of policy and policy making and policy statements?
Sure. So that's a good question. What I will say is policy making is necessarily collaborative. And the fact that we live in a world of frictionless communication makes it all the easier to, bring somebody halfway around the world into the decision-making process on the 7th floor. So it is necessarily collaborative. Where there has been, and this has really taken place under Hillary Clinton, where there is sort of new freedom and flexibility is, given the policy, what freedom does an ambassador have to advance that policy or communicate about that policy? So if you think about, sort of statements from the podium, both literally and proverbially, the traditional guidance that comes out of, the Harry S. Truman Building in Foggy Bottom. The guidance that we now give our diplomats, not just ambassadors, but the junior-most diplomats, is that, all right, in social media spaces that don't necessarily lend themselves to paragraphs of highly parsed sentences with semicolons, the freedom they now have, as long as they don't question or contradict the policy, they have far greater freedom to think about how best to communicate that, but also, more importantly, discuss it. So a lot of what we've been talking about is sort of communication out. And what I believe is that with social media, and what I tell our ambassadors, I actually taught at the ambassadorial seminar yesterday morning, I said, remember, you only have one mouth, but you have two ears. You as much as you might like to share and advocate for the point of view of the United States, I actually think that these can be of even greater benefit to you to actually learn something, to listen and learn. And I'm a big skeptic about propaganda in 2012. During the Cold War, when people got their information from, the one newspaper they read in the morning, the state-controlled broadcast, the state-controlled newscast they watched at night, our ability to influence people by quote-unquote pushing out a message is far greater than it is in a world in which people are getting their information from dozens or hundreds of sources. So I actually reject the notion that the internet and social media specifically can be a powerful tool for quote-unquote propagandizing. I think it's a good space for dialogue. I think it's a good space for sharing information and debunking myths and such things, but I actually think it's a lousy space for propaganda.
Director Oberholzer.
Hi, my name is Geneva Overholzer, and I'm the director of the journalism school here at Annenberg, and I'm intrigued by and very much agree with, of course, your notion that what we have had about hierarchies becoming much more networks of citizens And we certainly are seeing happen in the media here what you've just been describing about. It's no longer newspaper. As some of us who've been newspaper editors can say, you know, we were gatekeepers, but now we haven't noticed that the fence is largely gone. So the public can communicate with you all very differently, and when you want to communicate, you have to think very differently about how you do that. So talk some about how that's affected State Department communications domestically.
It's interesting. I mean, it's, as you yourself have said, you know, it's changed things. So, for example, you know, every Friday during the month of January, our spokeswoman, Toria Newland, you know, literally standing at the podium, the questions she answered were not from the diplomatic press corps, they were from Twitter. Every Friday, the questions she would answer in the press room from the podium were from Twitter. This is interesting. You know, we are now regularly directly connecting citizens to journalists. We are connecting citizens and journalists to senior diplomats in ways that we didn't previously do. So using Twitter, for example, 2 days ago, you know, our ambassador to NATO, Ivo Dalder. I mean, if you think about that, just ambassador to NATO, I mean, boy, it sounds like he's behind a high black gate, right? No, you know, if you use the hashtag AskEvo, you could engage in an online chat with them. Similarly, there are things, you know, beyond Twitter, through, you know, a lot of what we've done, again, over the last month, I did it personally, was we've used just video-enabled capabilities as a way of having what are, in essence, press conferences with people who couldn't afford a plane ticket to Washington, much less the credentials to sit in our press room. So I did a thing for 45 minutes where I literally sat in a press room in Washington and I had a press conference with 125 journalists from 30 countries, leveraging video technology. Our Director of Policy Planning did this last week. So it changed, and it's great because these are all real journalists, but they were journalists in Kosovo, in Guyana, in El Salvador, you know, who otherwise would never have gotten access to me. And so part of what this is doing is it's giving access to traditionally trained journalists from around the world who would not necessarily have had the resources or, for lack of a better word, power to be able to ask a question of the ambassador to NATO, the State Department spokesman, or myself.
Adam.
Alec, as the world becomes
And
more...
you are...
Adam Powell, I'm associated with the Annenberg School of... however, I'm retired as well. Retired but busy.
Yeah.
As the world becomes more urban, from China to Africa, or the UN says Africa is going to be a predominantly urban continent by 2020, how does that change this ecology?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I entirely know. It's interesting. I think that with the urbanization of I think with increased urbanization, a lot of the time you see increased homogenization in ways that, you know, weren't previously the case. I think I do not have a clear point of view on that. I think that as previously isolated rural populations go into environments that are networked, then they're going to be a part of media spaces and a part of information spaces that they weren't previously. In general, I think that the world is going to become less isolated. But I also think that you don't necessarily have to be in an urban center to do this, you know, which is a perfect segue to talking about cow menstruation. Let me tell you what I mean by that. The State Department sponsored a contest called Apps for Africa, where what we did is, you know, there are all these apps developers in East Africa, and also all of these civil society organizations trying to solve society's problems. And what we did is that we actually had a contest where the apps developers would develop apps for the problems identified by the civil society organizations. And the winner was this thing called iCow. And what iCow is, it is a voice-based and SMS-based app that lives on the cheapest cell phones possible, principally for dairy farmers in East Africa, to be able to better manage their herds. Everything from their breeding cycle, so literally, mapping out the menstruation cycles to be able to increase efficiency and productivity, to milking cycles, to market prices. So, this doesn't directly go to the point of urban versus rural, but one of the things that's interesting is we can see how urban capabilities, the apps developers in Kampala or in Nairobi can suddenly provide value to the historically isolated populations out in the bush. So anyway, interesting stuff.
Excellent. Back in the corner here, and then, yes.
Okay. My name is Evan Jones. I just got my diploma from my master's on Saturday. Thanks for signing it, Mr. I may even frame it. My question...
You certainly are paid for it. So.
Well played, sir. My question regarding what you're talking about in terms of international situations, and you're seeing in multivariated forms of regulation, both with permissive societies and those that are, just say, not so permissive, like China, Twitter. How does a digital distribution network, if I were to start one today, what's the best advice you could offer as far as formulating my own self-policing policies to be, exemplary of what we want to do with the internet as Americans, but not cutting ourselves off in the international market? Or
it's a great question. Before answering that, let me just say I know a number of you have noon obligations. So for those of you who leave, before you all leave, the one thing that I did want to say is that in the spirit of this discussion about social media and networks in the context of foreign policy, if you want to be able to stay in touch, you can follow me on Twitter at Alec J. Ross and subscribe at www.facebook.com/Alec_Ross1. So, having done that piece of housekeeping, so self-policing systems for people building a digital business, so to speak, in an international world with basically a patchwork of laws country to country. So, the first thing that I would do is I would constantly err on the side of openness, and I would test the boundaries of, the police's, of the law enforcement mechanisms that would seek to restrict and restrain what communications are able to take place there. That's just me. This is not necessarily being the best steward of shareholder value, but I actually think that you actually have to become pretty darn big more often than not before you are actually flagged. It was actually, Twitter now has at or around 200 million users, and it was just last week, with 200 million users and several years of business behind it, that it issued a policy for how it would comply with local law enforcement. So until you have tens of millions of customers, and until you really can't crack a market without sort of overt and public complicity with what the local restrictions are, I would say tilt on the side of openness. Do the right thing.
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, Mr. Alec Ross. My name is Wen, a second-year master's student of public diplomacy. So my question for you is related to the subject matters that we talked about Russia and China. I'm originally from China, now a U.S. citizen. So China and Russia are fighting so hard to gain the rights on internet. There's something called Internet Code of Conduct. So 2 months ago, before the holidays, there's one agent from CIA was being interviewed talking about this subject matter, and he mentioned something that really caught my attention, was that China right now is having U.S. private sectors coming into China and building signal stations just to break China's censorship, and all thing is funded by U.S. private sectors to provide freedom for Chinese internet users to access to information. And he's not willing to tell the public about those private sector's names. So he said that there's nothing to do with the state, but I want to hear about, as a star diplomat, what do you think? What's your take on this?
So So there are private sector efforts and there are state-based efforts. So the State Department, very proudly, since I've been at the State Department, we've spent about $70 million on trainings and to support the development of technologies that allow people to exercise their universal rights. You know, most of these are not public. A very few number of them are. You might be familiar with, as Dean Wilson mentioned, you know, this thing called the Internet in a Suitcase, which is being developed out of the New America Foundation. If you're not familiar with it, there was an article in the New York Times about it written by John Markoff and Jim Glanz, it's a very substantial piece. The second example of it is this thing that was developed called a panic button. One of the things that we saw, particularly in June of 2009 in Tehran, is that after activists would get arrested, a lot of the time the first thing that would happen is their cell phones would be seized, and their address books, their SMS, their emails would become this sort of guidebook to resistance movements. So we've supported the development of, you know, for lack of a better word, a panic button, which sort of wipes communications and address books, stores it to the cloud, and also sends out sort of a distress signal to a self-identified network of people that, you know, hey, I'm being taken down by the Mukhabarat or what have you. So I can't comment about the private sector efforts because they are any private sector efforts are legitimately independent of government. And without saying whether those are good or bad, what I will say is that we are supportive of efforts to allow people to exercise their universal rights, and we've backed this up with $70 million of funding of our own, as well as, you know, when you sit at tables like this and the people sitting around them are prime ministers and foreign ministers, and you know, you get the opportunity to talk about 2, 3, maximum of 4 things, making internet freedom something that is at the grown-ups table, a matter of discussion in diplomacy, I think is also very important.
We're going to take maybe 3 more questions, and I'm going to collect them. So we'll start here.
Thank you. My name is Catherine Keith. I'm a graduate of the Master's in Public Diplomacy program, and now I'm a vice consul for Public and Digital Diplomacy with the British Consulate here in LA. And thank you for coming to speak to us today. Related to what you've been saying about the public versus private sector, I was wondering what your thoughts on Twitter's decision to take down tweets at other foreign governments' requests, and if you've had any conversations with contacts at Twitter about that decision.
Yeah.
Here. Yes.
My name is Rachel. I'm a second-year public diplomacy student, and I think a fair number of us are graduating this semester. So I was wondering what kind of practical advice would you give to people looking for a career in the foreign service, or working for nonprofits or NGOs, where most of us will be engaging with a foreign audience?
Gabriel Kahn with the Journalism School. You've described, traditionally diplomats have dealt with other diplomats or governments in other countries. And you're describing examples in Syria, Zimbabwe, Russia, yep, where really the audience now is almost primarily the citizenry of that country. I'm assuming that other countries will take their state departments and foreign departments and have them dialogue directly with American citizens. I'm curious where you think this is all leading, this kind of diplomacy, because it sounds like it's going to require a tremendous cultural change inside of Foggy Bottom to deal with diplomacy that is so distributed. So I'm just wondering where you think this is heading in a couple of years.
Yep. Great. So quickly on all 3. Number 1, Twitter. I was actually with Jack Dorsey last week in Munich, and we did not discuss this. So there were not consultations between the United States government and Twitter. This was a private action taken by a private company, and it is their right to have taken the measures that they did in service of what their business goals are. What they did in essence is the exact same thing that companies like Google and Facebook had done previously. So when you get to a certain market size, this becomes one of the things that companies become compelled to do. But there was not communication or collaboration between Twitter or the United States government in advance of this. To the question about advice for people who are interested in sort of international relations, foreign service, and what have you, a great thing is to look at the Foreign Service. Take the Foreign Service exam. I mean, the Foreign Service as career, I think, is a fascinating one. And boy, talk about a different set of experiences. Yeah, look, I think that going to the Foreign Service in this day and age is a tremendous career opportunity, and I would counsel you to take a good hard look at that. I spent more than a decade working in the nonprofit sector before coming into government. I think that there is wonderful work there, and I support what's going on there. But I think that it's often you're constantly fighting for resources. You're constantly in a resource scarce environment. The work there is enormously important, but I would counsel you to take a look at the Foreign Service. As to your question about, what does this look like in the years ahead, and does this signal a significant cultural change at Foggy Bottom? Yes. Change is going to be incremental. The benefit that I have had over the past 3 years is I'm in a very hierarchical system. The State Department is, by its nature, one of those classic hierarchies. The thing that I've been privileged to have is the sort of gong-banging support of this and advocacy for this from the person at the top of the hierarchy, Hillary Clinton. And so Secretary Clinton, in her own words, she says, look, I may be non-native to these technologies, but I do know that more than half of the 7 billion people on planet Earth are under the age of 30, and what I do recognize is that the way that they consume, produce, and synthesize information is through connection technologies. So gosh darn it, our State Department had better catch up. Now, even with the support at the top, change has been incremental. I think it's been shocking how much has happened in so short a period of time, but we're an organization of 60,000 people distributed. I mean, there is no more global organization than the State Department. I mean, we have buildings everywhere. And so I think that this is going to be a years-long process. And what that means practically, for example, for me, is that I am obsessed with institutionalization. Political appointees come and go. People like me come and go. We're there for 2, 3, 4 years. I've been there for 3 years. If you stay for 4 years, you've made a long-term commitment as a political appointee. It's true. It's just a statistical truth. So what I'm very focused on are things from everything from reforming the Foreign Service exam to human resource policies, to making sure that we have smart guidance and other such things, getting into the unsexy stuff of institutionalization. I think that institutionalization is going to take place over the next 10 to 12 years, and I think it's principally going to be driven for all of the work that people like myself and others might do at the top of the hierarchy. At the end of the day, I think that this is the culture change that takes place there will largely take place by virtue of every year there being several hundred new diplomats that come in. And for them, this is all second nature. What's interesting is, every time I teach a new class of what we call the A100s, the new diplomats, for them, this is like, well, of course. This is all highly intuitive. And even in audiences like this one, most of you don't think of the internet as a dark and dangerous place. You recognize it as a place that can contribute to both the promise and peril of today and tomorrow, but it's a very relevant space. So for all the work we're doing at the top of the hierarchy and all the focus that we have right now on institutionalization, I think that the longest term change will be propelled by all of these 20-somethings who are entering the Foreign Service now and making decades-long commitments to the Foreign Service. So with that, thank you. Thank you, Professor. All right.